before the scream, before the pompadour, before the piano stool went flying across the stage and 18,000 people lost their minds simultaneously, and the world discovered it had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this sound, before any of that, there was a young man standing outside a door that would not open, then another door, then another after that. The story of Little Richard's rise is almost always told from the moment of arrival, from Tutti Frutti, from the charts, from the cultural earthquake of 1955 and everything that followed. It is a story that begins in most tellings at the point of ignition. What is rarely told, what tends to get compressed into a single sentence of context before the narrative races forward to the glory, is the years that preceded the ignition, the years of the closed doors, the years of the rejection letters and the unanswered phone calls and the label executives who listened to Richard Wayne Penniman perform and decided, with the confident authority of people who had no idea what they were hearing, that it was not what they were looking for. Those years shaped everything. The hunger they produced, the determination they forged, the particular quality of ferocity that eventually exploded out of a New Orleans recording studio in September 1955, none of it would have been possible without the rejection, without the doors that would not open, without the world's sustained, confident, consistently wrong insistence that what Little Richard had to offer was not something it needed. The world was wrong. It took it several years to figure this out, and in the space between the world's wrongness and its eventual correction, a young man from Macon, Georgia developed something that no amount of early success could have produced: the specific, unbreakable, almost irrational conviction that what he carried was real and necessary and worth fighting for, regardless of whether anyone in a position of institutional power was yet capable of recognizing it. That conviction became the foundation of everything, and this is the story of how it was built. Richard Wayne Penniman was not supposed to have a music career, not according to any reasonable reading of the circumstances he was born into. He was the third of 12 children in a working-class black family in Macon, Georgia, a city in the American South where the architecture of opportunity was designed, systematically and deliberately, to funnel people like him toward a narrow set of available futures. Manual labor, domestic service, the church, the military, these were the roads that were paved and lit. Everything else required navigating in the dark, without a map, against a current that most people eventually stopped swimming against. His father, Bud Penniman, was a practical man shaped by practical realities. He had survived by understanding what was possible and not wasting energy on what was not. Music, as a serious pursuit, as a livelihood, as the central organizing principle of a life, was not, in his assessment, possible, not for a black boy from Macon with no industry connections, no formal training, no resources beyond the extraordinary voice that God had apparently seen fit to place inside his son without providing any obvious means of converting it into economic security. Richard understood his father's position. He disagreed with it completely, and the disagreement was not articulated in arguments or confrontations. It was articulated in behavior, in the persistent, almost compulsive returning to music that characterized his childhood and early adolescence regardless of what the practical world said about it. He sang in church because the church was where singing was permitted. He performed on street corners because street corners required no permission. He imitated the gospel singers and the rhythm and blues performers he heard on the radio and in the clubs with a devotion that was less fan worship and more careful professional study, the study of someone who understood, before they had language for the understanding that this was their field and these were the people who knew it, and that observation was the beginning of knowledge. He left home young. The specific circumstances were painful. His father's death when Richard was still a teenager, the financial pressure on the household, the growing impossibility of remaining in a domestic situation that could not contain the person he was becoming. He found his way to Ann and Johnny Johnson, a white couple in Macon who ran a club called the Tick-Tock Inn, and who recognized in the young performer something worth nurturing. They gave him a place to live and access to a stage, and in return they received a performer who brought people through the door with an energy that was already, even in these early rough, edge performances, something unusual. He traveled with medicine shows, he performed with carnival acts, he sang in venues that ranged from reputable to actively disreputable, learning the craft of holding a room in the hardest possible conditions, audiences who had not come to see him specifically and owed him nothing. He learned to earn their attention rather than assume it. He learned that attention, once earned, could be built upon, that a crowd that was initially indifferent could be pulled, note by note and gesture by gesture, into genuine engagement, and that this pulling was both an art and a physical labor that demanded everything he had. By the time he began approaching record labels in the early 1950s, he had been performing for nearly a decade. He was not a beginner. He was not naive about what he could do. He had seen what his voice and his presence did to rooms full of people, had watched skeptical audiences transform into something close to reverent, had learned the specific techniques and instincts that made the transformation happen. He knew what he had. What he did not yet have was any mechanism for converting what he had into something the music industry could recognize and distribute. The labels were the mechanism. And the labels, it turned out, were not ready for him. The first recordings happened in Atlanta in 1951. Richard was 18 years old. He had secured an audition with RCA Victor, one of the major labels, a significant opportunity for a young performer with no industry connections and nothing but talent and determination to recommend him. He recorded 4 sides for RCA. The label released 2 of them as a single. The single went nowhere. RCA declined to renew the relationship. This was the first door. It closed with the particular quietness of institutional indifference. Not a dramatic rejection, not a confrontation, simply the absence of further interest. The label had heard him, had decided he was not what they were looking for, and had moved on. Richard received the message and filed it alongside the other information he was accumulating about the distance between what he knew he could do and what the world was currently prepared to acknowledge. He moved to Houston. He recorded for Peacock Records, a label run by Don Roby, a black entrepreneur who had built a significant rhythm and blues operation in Texas. Peacock was a more natural cultural fit than RCA had been, but the relationship did not produce the breakthrough Richard needed. The recordings he made for Peacock were constrained by the label's preferences and production approach, and they did not capture what he did when he was fully unleashed. They were competent. They were not revelatory. The label lost interest. Second door closed. He returned to the road. He kept performing. He played wherever he could get booked. Clubs, dances, theaters on the Chitlin circuit, the network of black-owned and black-serving venues that constituted the primary performance infrastructure for black artists in the era of segregation. He was building a regional following, earning a reputation among audiences and venue owners as a performer worth booking. The local knowledge of what he could do was growing. The national record industry's awareness of him remained minimal. He sent demonstration recordings to labels. He made phone calls that were not returned. He showed up at offices and asked for meetings and was told to leave his contact information with the receptionist. He auditioned when auditions were offered and waited for callbacks that did not come. This was the reality of pursuing a recording career from outside the industry's established networks in the early 1950s, a reality that was exponentially more difficult to navigate for a black artist from the South, operating without management or legal representation or any of the professional infrastructure that might have helped translate his talent into industry interest. The rejection was not always explicit. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was the polite non-answer that functioned as a no without requiring anyone to say the word directly. Sometimes it was the offer of a single and then the absence of follow-through. Sometimes it was the session that produced recordings that were then shelved without explanation. Each version of no had its own texture, its own particular way of communicating that the person in the room had heard what was being offered and found it insufficient. Richard heard all of these versions. He continued anyway. What sustained him through this period is not a simple question. Talent alone does not explain it. Talent, in the absence of external reinforcement, has a limited shelf life as a motivating force. Many talented people encounter sustained rejection and eventually conclude, reasonably, that the rejection is information, that what they have to offer is perhaps not as valuable as they believed, or that the cost of continuing to offer it against consistent resistance is too high. Richard did not reach this conclusion. Not because he was incapable of doubt. He had plenty of doubt, the specific, grinding, low-grade doubt that accompanies any serious effort that is not yet producing results. But alongside the doubt there was something else. Something that the years on the medicine shows and the chitlin circuit had produced, and that no number of label rejections could entirely dislodge the direct, unmediated, physical evidence of what his music did to people when they heard it. He had watched rooms transform. He had watched skeptical, distracted, exhausted audiences become something else entirely, present, alive, connected to each other and to him in ways that no other element of their evening had produced. He had felt the specific electricity that passes between a performer and an audience when both parties are fully committed to the same moment. He had experienced, in venues that had no reason to expect anything special from a traveling performer, the specific miracle of music working the way music is supposed to work, breaking through the protective surfaces that people maintain around themselves in daily life and reaching something underneath that responds to beauty and rhythm and the human voice with an immediacy that bypasses every defense. The labels had not heard this. The labels had heard demo recordings and audition performances and had applied their existing frameworks for what was commercially viable and had found the fit insufficient. But the audiences had heard it, in real time, in real rooms, with no framework between them and the experience, and their response had been unambiguous. Richard trusted the rooms over the labels. He trusted what he had seen with his own eyes, the transformation that happened in people when the music hit them, over the considered professional judgment of people who had heard him in controlled conditions and missed he was actually doing. This trust was not arrogance. It was evidence-based. He had the evidence. He kept returning to it when the industry's assessments grew discouraging, and he kept working, because the alternative, accepting the industry's verdict as final, would have required him to disbelieve the evidence of his own experience, and that was something he was constitutionally incapable of doing. By 1955, Richard had been attempting to secure a meaningful recording deal for approximately 4 years. He was 22 years old. He had recordings with 2 labels, neither of which had produced anything resembling a breakthrough. He had been through auditions and demo submissions and industry meetings that had gone nowhere. He had continued performing throughout, maintaining and building his regional presence, refining his craft in the relentless laboratory of live performance. He wrote a letter to Specialty Records in Los Angeles, an independent label that had been building a significant roster of rhythm and blues artists, and that had a reputation for working with performers whose sound did not fit the major label template. The letter was direct and without pretense. He was a performer from Georgia. He had something that was worth hearing. He would like the opportunity to record for the label. The letter arrived on the desk of Art Roop, Specialty's founder. Roop passed it to his A&R director, Robert Bumps Blackwell, a man whose ear for talent had already helped shape several significant careers and who had the specific quality of musical intelligence that enabled him to hear potential in rough, unfinished, unconventional material. Blackwell listened to the demonstration recording that Richard had included with the letter, and he heard something. Not the fully formed, commercially ready product that major labels typically required before expressing interest. Something more fundamental than that. An energy, a quality of presence, a voice that did things with sound that other voices were not doing. Things that Blackwell did not yet know how to describe precisely, but that he understood, in the way that people who have genuine musical intelligence understand things were worth pursuing. He brought Richard to New Orleans, to Cosimo Matassa's J&M studio. The session that followed would produce Tutti Frutti, and with it, the end of the years of rejection and the beginning of everything else. But the session almost didn't happen the way it happened. The initial recordings that day were not working, Richard recording more conventional material that was capturing none of what made him extraordinary. It was during a break, when Richard sat down at the studio piano and began playing something he performed in clubs, something raw and unpolished and alive with a specific kind of energy that the formal session had not yet produced, that Blackwell heard what he had come to New Orleans to find. He cleared the room. He brought in Dorothy Labostri to reshape the lyrics into something radio appropriate. He put Richard back in front of the microphone. And what came out? That opening cry, that incomprehensible eruption of pure human energy that preceded the first verse, was the sound of 4 years of closed doors finally opening all at once. The scream that changed the world was, in the most literal sense, the sound of everything that the world had refused and then could no longer contain. Tutti Frutti was released in late 1955. It entered the rhythm and blues charts immediately and climbed with a speed that suggested it had been waiting for release rather than building toward it. By early 1956, it had crossed over into the mainstream pop charts, an achievement that was genuinely unusual for a black artist recording for an independent label in that era, a crossing that required a song of sufficient force to override the various market mechanisms designed to keep rhythm and blues music in its designated commercial lane. The song did not politely request access to the mainstream. It simply arrived there, carrying too much energy to be redirected. Radio programmers who might have preferred to ignore it found that their audiences were requesting it. Record stores in markets that did not typically stock rhythm and blues found themselves ordering it to meet demand that had materialized without warning. And with the song came the full reality of Little Richard. Not just the recording but the performer, the spectacle, the complete and overwhelming experience of encountering him in person. The same energy that had been transforming regional audiences for years was now reaching national and then international audiences, and their response was essentially identical to the response of every club and theater and medicine show crowd that had preceded them. Something in them recognized something in him, and the recognition produced a reaction that bypassed reason entirely. The labels that had declined to work with him took note. Several expressed renewed interest. The interest was noted and filed appropriately. The relationship that mattered, the one that had been built with Bumps Blackwell and Specialty Records, the one that had finally provided the context in which what Richard carried could be captured and distributed. That relationship produced the recordings. Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, Good Golly Miss Molly, Lucille, Keep a Knock In. Each release arrived with the same concentrated force as Tutti Frutti. each one adding another dimension to the picture of what Little Richard was and what he could do. Within 18 months of Tutti Frutti, he was one of the most commercially successful and culturally impactful recording artists in the world, a transformation so complete and so rapid that it made the years of rejection look, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible. Almost, but not entirely, because the years of rejection were not simply an obstacle that had been cleared on the way to success. They had been something more than that. They had been the period during which Little Richard had become, definitively and irrevocably, the specific artist he needed to be in order to make the music he made. The hunger that the rejection produced, the fierce, uncompromising, almost physical hunger of a performer who has known what he has and has been told repeatedly that it is not wanted, that hunger was audible in the recordings. It was in the voice, in the piano playing, in the complete refusal to modulate or apologize or soften any edge of what he was doing. The scream that opened Tutti Frutti was not the scream of someone who had arrived easily. It was the scream of someone who had been waiting and fighting and refusing to stop for years. It was compressed time, 4 years of closed doors released in a single breath. This is what the story of the rejections is really about. Not the injustice of the industry, though that injustice was real and consequential. Not the vindication of persistence, though persistence was absolutely required and absolutely vindicated. It is about the relationship between resistance and force, about how the pressure that accumulates when something genuine and powerful is repeatedly blocked does not simply dissipate when the block is removed. It converts. It becomes the energy of the thing itself. The thing that the world refused and refused and refused until it could refuse no longer, and then could not stop listening to. The artists who came after Little Richard, who built their careers on the foundation he had laid, who absorbed his influence and carried it forward into new contexts, encountered a music industry that he had, in a very real sense, broken open for them. The doors that had been closed to him were less closed after him, not fully open. The music industry's resistance to certain kinds of innovation and to certain kinds of artists has never been a problem that resolves permanently or completely, but less closed. The evidence that what he had done was possible, commercially and artistically, made it easier for the people who came after to do versions of similar things. Elvis Presley recorded for Sun Records in 1954 and found a label willing to take risks on unconventional sounds. The Beatles signed with EMI in 1962 and transformed popular music within 2 years. Jimi Hendrix was signed to a major deal within weeks of being discovered in a London club. The infrastructure for recognizing and distributing genuine musical innovation, while still imperfect and still often unjust, had been partially rebuilt by the evidence that such innovation could succeed commercially at the highest level. Little Richard's 4 years of rejection were part of what built that infrastructure. Not by making the industry more enlightened. The industry's enlightenment was always partial and conditional and economically motivated rather than aesthetically principled. But by producing, when the rejection finally ended, a success so total and so undeniable that the industry's existing frameworks had to expand to accommodate what it demonstrated was possible. He did not set out to break the industry open for those who came after him. He set out to make his music and build his career and convert the evidence of what he could do, the evidence that the rooms had been providing and the labels had been ignoring, into something that the world could hear and respond to. But that is how these things work. The person who breaks through a wall is not usually thinking about the wall. They are thinking about what is on the other side of it. The wall's demolition is a consequence of their focus, not its object. Richard focused on the music, on the performance, on the specific, irreplaceable transaction between a performer and an audience that he had been working toward since he stood on street corners in Macon and discovered that a voice could stop strangers in their tracks. 4 years of labels saying no had not changed his understanding of what that transaction was worth. They had only intensified his need to make it happen on the largest possible stage. When it finally happened, when the scream went out over the radio and the world turned its head and found Little Richard standing there, pompadour immaculate, piano stool already mid-flight, the surprise was not his. He had known this was coming. He had known it with the stubborn, irrational, absolutely correct certainty of someone who has seen what their music does to people and has understood, against all institutional evidence to the contrary, that the world would eventually agree. It did. It took longer than it should have. It required more closed doors than any genuine talent should have had to face. It cost more than rejection should cost, in energy and time and the specific, grinding labor of continuing to believe in yourself when the people with institutional power have repeatedly communicated that your belief is unfounded. But it happened. And when it happened with the force of everything that had been building behind those closed doors, the hunger and the determination and the ferocity of a performer who had been told no so many times that yes, when it finally arrived, sounded like a scream. It was a scream. The most important scream in the history of popular music. and it had been forming in the silence behind all those closed doors for years. The world finally heard it, and it has never been entirely the same since.